Privacy, and I commend this bill to the House. Thank you.
I call the Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Can I say first of all that it's a pleasure for me to speak on the first reading of the Privacy Information Sharing Bill, and I want to start my contribution by acknowledging the member who's just resumed her seat, welcome her back to the House, but more particularly to acknowledge her courage towards the end of last year in speaking out about her personal involvement with domestic violence. I think that's a leadership role that is very seldom played by women members of Parliament. It isn't an easy thing to do. You don't need to do it. One doesn't need to do it. You clearly couldn't do it, Mr Speaker, but I just want to acknowledge and thank Dr Jackie Blue for that bit of work. Having said that, I think the contribution that Dr Blue made omitted to reference any of the concerns that we may have, whether because of reality or perception, and the subsequent downsides that are possible in this bill. And in my view, her proposal that it needs to be fast-tracked should be viewed with some concern, because the devil is in the detail of this legislation. My colleague Charles Chauvel has already clearly outlined that in his contribution at the primary part of this debate. The new member for New Zealand First, Dennis O'Rourke, in just a matter of days here, has already found some issues of concern in the detail, not in the principle. In fact, if you read the explanatory note, it's motherhood and apple pie. Well, that's not the way that legislation works, and particularly when it's legislation that often impacts on people's perception of what happens to information, particularly information that is gathered by government departments, and the potential harm that could be done. Jan Logie's contribution earlier on raised similar concerns. I don't agree that we should therefore say, well, we shouldn't do this. We don't want to improve information sharing. Of course we do. But the concerns need to be considered and robustly addressed. Privacy, protection, but most of all, ensuring that when information is shared, it can do no harm to individuals should be the most important criteria, and I'm not sure that the debate has had that contribution strongly enough made throughout it. So I would urge the Select Committee to consider the genuine concerns that people have, and not say, well, that won't happen. Say, how can we ensure beyond doubt that it won't happen, because it is not the intention of this legislation to do any harm. This bill has been around in one form or another for a long time. It came out originally of the Law Commission review of the privacy legislation, and the privacy legislation certainly needed that sort of comprehensive review. That original act was from 1993. That's a long time ago. It's before many of the tools that we currently use, without even giving them a moment's thought, where we gather and share information. It was before the widespread use of emails, before we use the internet as we do now, certainly before social media and before smartphones. So the original privacy legislation actually was written long before many of the things that we needed to consider and cover. So the Law Commission started this comprehensive review in October 2006. They only finished it last year. They had a lot on. They did a big job. So it appropriately and understandably took them that length of time. The Law Commission's report back to the then Minister, the Honourable Simon Power, now the Chief Executive of Westpac Private Banking, and I congratulate him on that new role, but also on the considerable amount of work that he did in this legislation. They made a number of recommendations to the Honourable Simon Power. They said that the Privacy Commissioner's powers needed to be augmented, that the Privacy Commissioner needed specifically a new power to issue compliance notices and, where there was a good reason for it, to require, not just request, but require an audit of an agency's information handling process. So that's quite a big extension of the Privacy Commissioner's powers. The Law Commission recommended a streamlining of the complaints process under the legislation so that the Privacy Commissioner would have the ability to make binding decisions on people's complaints where those complaints were about access to their own personal information. And it made another significant recommendation about agencies being required to notify people when personal information about them, which was held by an agency, was lost or compromised. At the moment, there's no requirement to do that. So if we had computer hacking, if somebody's emails had been hacked into and personal information held by an agency was lost or compromised as a result of that or some other action, then the agency would be required to notify that person. They are big issues. They were strong and clear recommendations from the Law Commission, and when I look through the legislation, I can't find them. And I would really like to know why. I'd like to know why both the Honourable Simon Power and the Honourable Judith Collins presumably looked carefully at the Law Commission report and said this is a comprehensive review that they've done over 5 years. They've made all these recommendations, some of which focus on the protection end of the information sharing spectrum, and others focus on the information sharing end of the spectrum. But we just need to go ahead with these two recommendations. Well, I don't understand that, and I think the Select Committee will be very keen to know why, when you get not a little bitsy look at it, but a comprehensive review by an independent organisation like the Law Commission, why do we just pick the bits that make the information sharing easier and not address the issues that protect people's privacy, have a streamlined complaints process, have a requirement for the agency to tell people if their information held has been compromised or lost? Well, why don't we do that? Well, I don't think it makes sense, and I'm really disappointed in both ministers in that regard. Mr Chairman, I think it's going to be a very interesting debate. As my colleague Charles Chauvel has already noted, Labour will be supporting this bill to Select Committee. That's our usual practice. We usually oppose bills going to Select Committee if we are strongly opposed to the principle of that legislation, if it just doesn't fit in with any values that we can share. But if we think the bill has got some merit and can be improved, or it doesn't go far enough, or it has some deficiencies, we will certainly want it to progress to Select Committee so you can have the benefit of hearing perhaps from the Law Commission what do they think of their comprehensive report being shortchanged in this way, and just the little bits of it being taken out. It would be very interesting to hear their view on that. But also, I would be very interested in the practitioners who work closely with families who are dysfunctional, who abuse their children. What is the best way to ensure that the information that is gathered by various agencies about those families and vulnerable children, what's the best way to ensure not that the information is shared, but something is done about the information once it is shared? And that was the very point that my colleague Jacinda Ardern was making in relation to the Green Paper. It's all very well having lots and lots of discussion about things, but as I actually recall the Minister herself, Judith Collins, saying when she was in opposition that it's really important that something be done about it, and I haven't seen any of that action yet. Mr Speaker, the other concerns I have are in relation to the points that Jan Logie made, that we may have young or vulnerable people who desperately need access to support of some sort or other, generally through a government department or agency. They might need access to the health system, they might need access to income support, they might need access to some sort of social service or support, Housing New Zealand, any number of types of support services, and they might be too afraid to approach that agency for support because of a fear, justified or otherwise, about personal information being shared. We cannot have that as an acceptable situation in New Zealand. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to conclude by saying the idea that's in the explanatory note, this is going to lead to better, smarter services, nobody could argue with. It's motherhood and apple pie. Our primary concern must be for the privacy and support of individual New Zealanders.
I call the honourable member Simon